Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, John.
You must have been waiting for me to say that. Took me so long, sorry. I'm going to apologise for a start because I have given this sermon before, but it was about 40 years ago. So I would probably flatter myself to think that anyone would remember it. About 40 years ago, and that's why this sermon is connected, I found myself a single parent. It was not what I expected, it was not what I had planned, but suddenly I found myself alone with my 3 children. And Lisa was 10, Josh was 7, and Ben was 4. But I got great help from someone else in the same position. Some of you might remember John Wright's little sister Janice. She was also a single parent, had a little girl Sally who was about the same age as my Lisa. And I guess because we found ourselves in a similar situation, we sort of got together and helped each other. She lived in Beechworth and I lived in Sydney, so we didn't physically get together that much, but we certainly, on school holidays, sort of caught up a bit at some camps and phone calls, and no emails in those days, so it was just letters. But we did share with each other the sort of things that you go through when you're a single parent. And she gave me something which has stayed close to my heart ever since. Well, she didn't give it to me, she lent it to me. It was a little booklet from her father who had given to her. Her dad, Harold Wright, had given her this little booklet. I guess some of you remember Harold. He gave her this booklet, and it was a booklet which was entitled, But If Not. Now, most will probably recognise that that comes from Daniel chapter 3. But it stayed with me, and when she lent it to me, I went and photocopied it. And I must say, Jan and I still stayed in contact, probably once or twice a year. These days it's easier with a text or an email, and she often, well, I guess at least once a year we have a good phone conversation. She likes to find out how Ben's doing. I think Ben was her favourite of my kids. The baby always is. But yeah, we still catch up and we still talk to each other, and Sally's a grandmother now. That's hard to believe. But we look back on those times, and this book that she gave me from Harold, I photocopied it at the time because it was precious to her, and obviously I didn't want to take it from her. So I kept the photocopy and she kept the booklet. But it was back in the 1970s, and I don't know whether you remember, you'd have to be at least 60 to remember this, I presume, that photocopies used to go black back in those days. If you photocopied something in the 1970s and you put it in the sunlight, it would go pitch black. So you had to hide them from light. You had to sort of poke them inside a book or something. Dockets from shops used to do it too. Do you remember in the 70s and 80s? Shop at dockets would go black if you left them out in the light. And so I very preciously kept my photocopy of it. And I've read it many times since. And I guess I tried to find out who wrote it. I tried to find out who the author was. No author on it. It was written in England from Keswick in July 1914, just before the war, I guess, and there must have been some anticipation of the war back in those days. It's written in quite beautiful language. I quite envy the way they used to write back in those days. Very elegant compared to what we write now. But I could never find out who it was. I searched the web to try to find out a copy of it. I googled But If Not, and if you do that, you'll find thousands of hits. Everybody and their dog has written something on But If Not, because that's a very popular passage out of Daniel. So no, I never did find it. So I only had the one copy until suddenly, I'm pretty slow catching up with technology, but I suddenly realised that I do have a dictation mode on my word processor, on my computer with my Word docs. And so I've started reading it. And magically, the computer is writing it for me. So here it is, all these years later, slowly being written. As I said, it was written from Keswick in England in 1914, and from reading the context, it was apparently written after some sort of retreat or some sort of Bible school that had been gathered together. Apparently by a gathering of pastors or ministers, or presumably would have been the Church of England. But it was apparently this group of pastors who had been on some retreat, and they, after their week together, had felt that they were on some spiritual high. They had obviously felt that they were going to go forth into the world, and they were going to convert not just their flock, but the world. That there would be great blossoming of spirituality, that there would be a revival. And this book was written to tell them to be prepared for that not to happen. It was to prepare them for disappointment, that what they had planned in life may not unfold, and they have to have a backup plan. No, they don't. God's got the backup plan. And when I read it, I thought of the Bible schools I'd been to. I don't know whether you have lovely memories of Bible weeks. A lot of people speak very lovingly of the Mittagong weeks. They used to always talk about that as being wonderful. I never went, so I don't know. I think a lot of people like these days to go to the Armidale one. And I think in general, everybody feels on a spiritual high. It feels like you've just captured a little bit of the kingdom of God. You are there with people of like mind. You're there with people who are driven by the Spirit of God. You are there with people whose contact with each other is in love. And when those weeks finish, you feel like you could come away and you could float for the rest of your life. And guess what? You don't. And that's what this book was written about. I think the first time, I must have, in the young people's groups in the church, I must have gone away on some camps, etc. But the one that really stuck with me, the first one, was probably when I was in my 20s, I think. It was around about 1974, 75. A camp at Mount Lamington, which is on the border of Queensland and New South Wales. It was basically a young people's camp. And I quite fell in love with it. First of all, I was greatly disappointed that Mount Lamington wasn't a huge chocolate covered in flakes of coconut. But the fact is that it actually turned out to be a lovely campsite. It's quite rainforesty up in that area. It's quite lovely. Very famous for a plane crash in years gone by. You can Google it. But it was quite lovely. Everybody felt, again, like there was some community feeling, as though we all belonged to God, as though all of us were true brothers and sisters. The camp hymn that was chosen was that one that Robin played for us this morning, the last hymn there, Make Me a Channel of Your Peace. And I think everybody wanted to be a channel of God's peace. And it was the first time ever I came across this. Some of you will look at it and say, ah, yes. Some of you will say, what the heck's that? It was the first time I was introduced to music that wasn't 150 years old. And it was the first time that I really found joy out of this little book called The Joy Book, and it had all the modern music in it. I came across Larry Norman, who was a Christian rock singer back in the 70s. He's now called the father of Christian rock. He was then the son of Christian rock. I came across all of these things that were new to me, and I felt absolutely on a high. All of us did. We all felt like Elijah coming down from the mountain, Mount Carmel. It felt like the Spirit of God had come down and all the people had been converted. And that's what this little booklet's written about. That's how these people felt. Obviously in 1914 they would have all been men that have all been pastors and ministers of their churches. And they came down and out of that mount of the presence of God, feeling they could go out and change the world. And this book was written to prepare them for the fact that they won't. And I will read some excerpts from the book. These three words, but if not, can lead us into great realms of faith. When we come to surrender to Christ, we develop great expectations of what God will do for us. We expect large changes in experience, large renewals of strength, large openings of service. To those who may not realise these expectations, whose experience does not match their expectations and find themselves disappointed, to those this book was dedicated. And he goes on to say that I want to show that God has greater answers than you have ever anticipated. Our expectations may not be fulfilled, they'll be exceeded. And we need an explanation for that, because sometimes it seems like the disappointment remains. Reading from Daniel chapter 3 verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego answered the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. We're all familiar with those words, and I'm sure as soon as you say the words, but if not, every one of us will remember that passage. What a delightful paradox it is. The three young men didn't say, God is able to save us. They said, he will save us. But if he doesn't? That's a paradox. How can you say he will save us, but if he doesn't? But we all know what they meant. I think that's a phrase that every one of us treasured. Because they were going to be saved out of the king's hand no matter what. Even if they were thrown in the furnace and burnt to a crisp, they were still saved out of the king's hand, because they would find themselves with all the faithful in God's kingdom, living an immortal life. So they were going to be saved. But they were going to be saved on this occasion in a way that saved someone else as well. Now, we may say that phrase ourselves. There's many times where I would have said to my children, I'll pick you up after school. But if I don't, can you walk down to Matt's place and I'll meet you there? I will pick you up after school, but if I don't. But that's not a paradox for human beings, because we all understand that. I might have a car accident on the way home and I can't pick them up. I might get arrested. I might get taken to hospital. Anything could happen, but that can't happen to God. God can't get sick or have an accident. If the three friends said he will deliver us from the king's hand, then they meant exactly that he would. And that was going to happen either then or in the kingdom. And so they said, God will deliver us, but if not, we will not worship your idol. Our resolve is unshaken. We still believe. If we expect and depend on God's leading us into what we hope for or what we expect, if we depend on his deliverance, we may be lost in our faith, lost unless we have an alternative, unless we can see something else in the shadow of what we were hoping for. We will not serve the world, even if God has not done what we know he could and trusted he would. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego said, our God is able. He will deliver us. But if not, his will is still supreme. If he does not do what we expect, and we still believe, even though we have no evidence for our faith. Even if his will contradicts our expectations. And I will read some of the extracts from this little book. Christ may contradict my expectations. Christ may contradict my aims. It is faith that says, but if not, my course is already clear. But if not, my determination is already made. But if not, my resolve is entirely unaltered. It is by these non-fulfilling of our expectations that we see his ways. And then there's a small excerpt which I think he quotes from someone else. If all my years were summer, how could I know what my Lord means by make me white as snow? How could I understand, wipe away all tears from all eyes, had I not cried? If I were not weary, how could I understand he gives his loved ones rest? And how could I understand he will never leave me or forsake me unless I had been left and forsaken? And I'll go on reading. This alternative to disappointed faith tests the entire quality of the man who possesses the faith of God. I know the man, I have him in my mind tonight, who, being disappointed in his experience, nervously begins to pity himself. The man to whom consequence is everything. When God contradicts his expectation and longing, his faith is staggered and his backsliding begins. I know the man who is willing to accept a shallow answer to a great question, the man to whom disappointment becomes disbelief, the man who measures God in the tiny scales of his own self-consciousness. But on the other hand, I know the man who has learned to say courageously with these three Hebrews, but if not, there will be no deviation from my duty. Its dominance shall be entirely unaffected in my life. But if not, if no ecstatic joy fills me, if no revival results appear in my work, I mean to go on to the next thing. If I do not get the sunshine in all its full-orbed glory in my life, I mean to follow the gleam which I have already seen. If I cannot see the distant scene, I can at least see one step ahead. God has given me enough light to walk by, and in any case, I'm going on with his work. Therefore, in the calm confidence of a child, I may say with these three Hebrew children, I'm expecting God to do wonderful things for me. I'm expecting God to break down iron gates before me and to beat down my foes all around me. I'm expecting God to give me great and wonderful power in his work, manifested by souls gathered in and breaking forth of blessings all round. But if he does not, I'm still going on with him, persuaded that he does all things well. His wisdom is my sheet anchor and his faithfulness my stay. In the case of the three Hebrews, God didn't do just what they had asked, but he exceeded it. He didn't just deliver them from the fire. He did something they had no idea would happen. They probably expected and hoped that maybe the fire would be quenched. Maybe some miracle would happen. Well, a miracle did happen, but it happened in the flames. They weren't saved from the flames, they were saved in the flames. But a greater thing happened that day. God saved 4 men. Something they probably had no concept could possibly happen. A greater thing happened. God saved Nebuchadnezzar as well. Reading again, they said, he's going to check your hand, O king. But he did not do it at all. He did something greater. He changed the king's heart and brought him to a knowledge of his almighty power and grace. Oh, great there your expectations are, they're not great enough. Great though the promises are of your conception tonight, that conception is not nearly great enough. God is going to do an infinitely larger and more influential thing in our lives if we will stand by him. And how does this apply to us? We look at our lives. Many of us have lived our life. We don't have much of a future in this world. And we look back, were there times our expectations were not met? Were there times when we trusted God would do something that wasn't done? A marriage that turned out to be less than we'd hoped for. A marriage that didn't give the promise of sweetness and light that we thought would come. Children who chose a different path than the one we had wished for them. Careers that never developed in the way we had wanted. Failing health when we had prayed for health. But in every one of those cases, God is doing a greater thing in every one of them. You are lined up for a marriage that will not fail. You are lined up for a marriage where you'll be the bride and your bridegroom will be faithful and will protect you in everything and give you in everything that you've desired, every desire of your heart. We are children of a Father who will never fail us. And the child-parent relationship will never break down, and we'll live forever with our Father. And we will not be disappointed. Careers that never developed and health mean nothing. God has planned for us something much greater than those things that we thought were so important. I will give a few examples that I think show us some lovely applications of those three words, but if not, I want to talk for a moment about the prophet Jonah. Jonah must have been so excited when God talked to him and said, "Go to King Jeroboam and tell him I have heard the cry of the people of Israel." Jonah, go and stand in front of Jeroboam and say, "The Lord has heard the cry of his people. He has seen the anguish of the people of Israel. He will send you in might and power, and you will crush your enemies." How excited Jonah must have felt about that. And so he goes to Jeroboam and he says, "You are going to extend the kingdom of Israel right up to Lebo Hamath and right down to the Salt Sea, and Judah will extend the kingdom right down to the river of Egypt." Jonah must have felt that he was the one prophet, the last prophet, because suddenly what was happening, the promises to Abraham were in front of him, unfolding. The promise to Abraham promised the land from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt, and Jonah saw it happening. And Israel had been so weak under Ahab. When Ahab fought against Ramoth in Gilead, he only had 7,000 soldiers. Now Jeroboam II is so strong, he's overcoming the strongest kingdoms in the region. He overcame Syria. Didn't just make Syria a vassal state, he swallowed up Syria so that it disappeared. The great enemies, Hazael, Ben-Hadad, all of these people gone. And the kingdom of Israel is spreading. And I can imagine in the heart of Jonah him saying, "We've just got to take Assyria." Once Assyria has fallen, the whole promise to Abraham comes true. And God says to him, "I'm not going to smash Assyria, I want you to save them." What? But I'm almost there. I've almost got the promise to Abraham in my hand. "No," God said, "I'm going to do a greater thing." It took a long time for Jonah to understand what that greater thing was. It wasn't just the land from the Euphrates down to the river of Egypt that was God's land, it was the whole world. And Jonah was to be one of the prophets who took the gospel to the world. And he became a light to the Gentiles. And I certainly believe that he remained there all because of the words, "I don't understand, God. I don't understand why you are not giving me the land promised. But if that's not your plan, then I will follow with you." Elijah, coming down from Mount Carmel, he must have been so excited. All the prophets that had gone before had failed to change the heart of the people. But with this great power, the fire from heaven, he had changed the people. They all called out, "We will worship the Lord." And the next day, Jezebel was after his blood. Where were the people who had stood up and said, "We will worship the Lord"? And he ran for his life. And he came and he talked to God. And God said to him, "I got something bigger for you, Elijah. You thought that you were going to convert the people of Israel? I want you to anoint Jehu to be king over Israel. I want you to anoint Elisha to be a prophet in your room, but I also want you to anoint Hazael to be king in Syria." Why? What had Yahweh got to do with the king of Syria? Oh, God had a bigger plan. He was going to go out beyond Israel. It wasn't Israel. It was the whole world that was going to see this light. It was going to go out to all the Gentiles. And so Elijah said, "I may not understand if it wasn't what I wanted, but if not, I'll still follow you." And Job must have been so conflicted in what was happening. He thought that if he followed God, blessings would flow, and they had for the first 60 or 70 years. But suddenly it all stopped, couldn't understand. But never ever did he doubt that there was a God and that he would eventually see his Redeemer on the earth. And so Job was able to say, "God will bring me forth to the light and I shall behold him. But if not, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I know that my Redeemer lives." And so we come to the very last, "but if not." And we turn our attention now to the emblems on the table. And remember the words of Jesus as he was in the garden. The ultimate, "but if not." God, can you deliver me from this cup? Can you take this cup from me? Can you save me from this baptism which is coming? But if not, my course is still set. But if not, I will endure the sacrifice.